Hello there, people of the internet. I have a completely hypothetical situation for you guys, and I want to hear you guys' thoughts. This was something that I thought about not too terribly long ago, and I wrote it down on a piece of paper somewhere. And I was like, hey, let's make a video talking about exactly that. And I've already got the hiccups whenever we're getting started. So the idea is, should NATO have adopted 762 by 39? I'm doubtful that they would actually adopt 762 by 39 with it being a comm block, round. And the whole reason of NATO existing is to go against the comm block countries. So I imagine they would probably adopt some sort of variation of 762 by 39, kind of like how the Russians adopted the 545 in response to NATO having the 556 NATO. So completely hypothetical. Should NATO have adopted some variation of 762 by 39? Let's go ahead and let's talk about that before we get started. Though, if you like topics like this, what if scenarios, etc., and you like old school firearms like this right here, subscribe to the channel because you're among the right crowd and I play around with these things all the time. Speaking of playing, I am not currently at my range. I'm sure you guys have noticed. I do not have access to my range currently. So if you want to help me get access to a range, then links to Patreon and Utreon are down below, or you can go buy yourself a t-shirt that'll help support the cause, or do a one-time donation through the t-shirt website. So 762 by 39, I am a huge advocate for this cartridge, and I say that for the average gun owner, this right here is probably the best cartridge that you can have. It's capable out to 400 yards, and for the average shooter, at least in terms of a civilian shooter, most people aren't going to be very accurate out and beyond that anyway, and most people aren't going after things that 762 by 39 is not adequate enough to be able to take down. Like I said, this right here is probably the best cartridge for the average shooter. Now, there are some situations where you might need something more powerful, so like 762 NATO or like 308 or something like that, 30-06. Those might be better options for very, very, very limited cases. But for the most part, an intermediate 30 caliber cartridge like 762 by 39 should be adequate enough to be able to take care of most things. So you guys already know I'm a huge advocate because of exactly that right there. But from a civilian context, with this being probably the best cartridge that civilians can go to, is it the best cartridge from a military context? So let's take into ideas some history. This is a cartridge that was actually in development during World War II. The Russians started working on it in 1943, I do believe, and it did not actually become a thing until after World War II. There might have been some use with this cartridge at the very end of World War II, but for the most part, it didn't actually start seeing use until after World War II. However, the adoption of 556 NATO, that came like over a decade later, probably closer to 2 decades. I can't remember the actual date off the top of my head. However, 556 NATO came after the adoption of 762 NATO, and both of these cartridges are on the low end or high end in terms of power and capabilities in comparison to 762 by 39. We're not talking about specialty rounds. I'm sure somebody's going to go into the comments and say, that's nonsense. Go look at this video or that video talking about how 556 outperforms against 762 by 39. We're talking about military ammunition, ball stuff like full metal jackets, plain Jane 223, 556, and plain Jane 762 by 39. If we want to get into the civilian market with all the available projectiles on the civilian market, then that's a completely different discussion. So from a military context, 762 by 39 is right smack dab in the middle in terms of power and capabilities in comparison to 223, 556, and 762 NATO. NATO adopted both those cartridges, and the Russians had their 762 by 39, and they ended up keeping their 762 by 54 rimmed, and ultimately, inevitably, over time, they would end up going with 545 in response to 223, 556. However, if NATO ended up going with a 30 caliber cartridge that was similar to 762 by 39, I feel like we would not see the existence of 545 from the Russians, because they would not need to counteract, say, 556 from NATO forces. What would be the benefits of NATO adopting a 30 caliber cartridge like this, a 30 caliber intermediate rifle cartridge? Well, basically all of the reasons as to why Russia decided to go with the intermediate cartridge concept, whereas NATO for a long period of time was going with 7.62 NATO, which is a full power rifle cartridge in an intermediate cartridge platform. It mimics the capabilities of military ball 30-06, but at the same time, it's basically a shorter version of a 30-06, which is where the idea of it being an intermediate cartridge comes from. So, although it is, I guess, classified as an intermediate cartridge just in name, it is not an intermediate cartridge in capabilities. It is absolutely a full-powered rifle cartridge. So, if NATO decided to not adopt that full-power rifle cartridge, and instead adopt a true intermediate 7.62 by 39 style cartridge, a true intermediate cartridge, then I feel like we wouldn't even see the existence of 7.62 NATO or even 5.56 NATO. It would be possible, and it would be, in all honesty, very, very likely that NATO would end up adopting something like 7.62 by 39, and then they would probably keep something like the 30-06. They would likely keep the 30-06 like the Russians kept the 7.62 by 54 rimmed, and then they would have their 30 caliber cartridge. And I don't think that we would see 22 caliber high velocity cartridges come out and be used in NATO forces. I feel like this right here would be the go-to. So the Russian standard of the 7.62 by 39 cartridge, it tends to send a 123-ish grain bullet at around 2,400 or so feet per second. There are some variations based off of who's making it and year of production and country and origin and barrel length, etc., but that's around the ballparks that you're going to come to expect. And I foresee NATO, if they would have done something similar with a 30 caliber cartridge that mimics 7.62 by 39, we would probably see a situation where we would see something with very similar ballistics. A lot of what was going on with NATO, they were actually trying to adopt, I believe, like a 270 style cartridge that was going to be significantly less recoil, significantly more capable, a significantly better option than 7.62 NATO, which ultimately the United States ended up like strong-arming NATO into adopting. So a lot of the 7.62 NATO coming into existence comes from the United States like strong arming, and the same situation with 5.56. However, if NATO decided not to go with that and decided to instead adopt a cartridge similar to 7.62 by 39, let's say instead of a 270 round, they were working on an intermediate 30 caliber cartridge. Then they ended up adopting it. I don't feel like it's hard to really come up with the significant ideas. I don't feel like the AR platform would be nearly as popular and predominant around the world as it currently is. And I don't foresee the United States adopting the 223 5.56 and keeping it as their mainline cartridge. Just like whenever they adopted the M14, they ended up adopting something else not very long after that. I feel like after the adoption by the United States for that 223 5.56 cartridge in the AR platform, once they see that NATO is, like all of NATO is using a cartridge similar to 7.62 by 39, they're probably going to jump ship and either chamber the AR platform in that particular cartridge and adopt that cartridge. Like if NATO decided the United States was not going to strong arm them, they would likely end up adopting the AR in that new cartridge. And I mean, this is entirely speculation, but I feel like the 223 5.56 cartridge would not be nearly as predominant as it is nowadays, especially if the United States military ended up not adopting it. And there's a strong possibility that 7.62 NATO and 30-06 would end up not being a thing either. Because even though the United States was working on the 7.62 NATO project, it is possible, it definitely is possible that 7.62 NATO would still exist because they were working on that before the 5.56. But if NATO was already working on a 30 caliber cartridge, I don't know, there's a lot of speculation whenever it comes to that. I'll go ahead and say that it's definitely possible 7.62 NATO would exist, but I really, really do not foresee those 22 caliber projectiles, those 22 caliber high velocity projectiles being anything. I don't foresee those taking up off the ground, and I don't foresee those being as predominant around the world from a military context as they are nowadays. So if NATO adopted something similar to 7.62 by 39, I feel like we would see significantly different weapons technology than what we see nowadays. I don't think that we would necessarily copy comm block weaponry, but I feel like we would definitely utilize firearms platforms that are more developed for a 30 caliber cartridge as opposed to the AR platform like the AR-15 platform in 223.556. We might see something more like AR-10 platforms all over the place, chambered in this intermediate cartridge. But man, it's really hard to tell with these what-if situations. I'm basically just going over things inside of my head as I go through with this. I had no script, I had no anything like that. I just saw this written down on a piece of paper, and I was like, yeah, let's go ahead and sit down and think and process on that some. So what do you guys think? What if NATO did adopt something like 7.62 by 39? I don't think that they would adopt comm block weaponry, but like, yeah, it's really, really hard to tell. I don't think they'd adopt comm block weaponry. I think that they would develop their own firearms around their own 30 caliber intermediate cartridge. But I'm betting that 30-06 would probably still be the mainstream full power rifle cartridge, and all the countries would end up adopting it. That would be what the United States strong arms them into. Adopting the 30-06 and keeping that, just like the Russians had ended up keeping 7.62 by 54 rimmed. And the reason why I say keeping the 30-06 just like the Russians kept the 54 rimmed is because clearly NATO would be getting influence from what the Russians are doing if they end up adopting an intermediate 30 caliber cartridge. I find the concept absolutely fascinating, and I hope that you guys do as well. So all this being said, let me know what you guys' thoughts are down below. I'm excited to see what you guys have to say. And I think I've rambled on enough for this particular subject. Thanks for watching, folks. Appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share. The description below has a link to all sorts of stuff. Go check it out. You guys go off, have yourself a fantastic day, and I will see you guys on the next episode. Since I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. Poor man's Garrett. It's a shame that bolt-action shotguns aren't more mainstream.